What makes a quilt a quilt? Let's think about it. A quilt is a bed covering, right? And by definition, a quilt has three layers. It has a cover, which is usually made of patchwork or multiple fabrics pieced together. It has a squishy middle called the batting, and it has a backing. So that's what makes a quilt a quilt. And what are the practical reasons for having a quilt? Well, first of all, to keep you warm at night, right? It's a blanket. And then it's also a useful way to use up scraps of fabric, little pieces, and make it into one big thing and being resourceful with your material, right? But so often a quilt is much more than these two practical uses. So often people put stories about their own lives and their own ideas into their quilts. My name is Elizabeth Gronke, and I'm happy to be working at the American Folk Art Museum in their Folk Art Reflections program. And this is another video visit. Today we're going to be looking at three artworks that are in a current exhibition at the time of this recording called What That Quilt Knows About Me. It's a very intriguing title. What could a quilt know about a person? Or, as I like to think about it as I looked at the exhibition, what can I learn about this quilt's maker just by looking at it? By looking at the material they used, the choices they made artistically. It's very, very interesting. And I hope that as we look at these quilts together, and as I present you with some questions or thoughts and things for you to look at and talk about with the people around you, that you'll think about those things yourself. If you were to make a quilt, what would you put in it? What would you use to design it? What would the fabric tell us about you? So let's begin. As I said, this exhibition is called What That Quilt Knows About Me, and it's up at the American Folk Art Museum until October 29th, 2023. The curators of this exhibition, Emily Javalt and Sade Iorinde, who is pictured here giving an art talk in the galleries, had an interesting experience where they were researching for the exhibition and came across a quote by an anonymous quilter. And here's what it says: "My whole life is in that quilt. My hopes and fears, my joys and sorrows, my loves and hates. I tremble sometimes when I remember what that quilt knows about me." It's kind of a powerful thing to say, right? It's the idea that what you create has a little bit of yourself in it. So, with that in mind, let's start looking at some of the artworks in this exhibition and consider what we notice. What are we seeing that's going to give us a clue about that person? I'll start with an image that was taken inside the gallery. In this photo, directly in front of us, we see hanging on the wall a long rectangular quilt. It's got a lot of colors. And if you're watching this with someone, I encourage you to pause the video at this time and just share a couple things that you're noticing about it. Particularly, I'd like you to pay attention to where it's light and where it's dark. It almost looks like there's a spotlight shining on it. But in fact, this quilt is called Light from Faraway Space. And it was quilted by an artist from Japan who learned quilting back in the 1970s when she lived in California. And she's using a traditional American technique. But you'll notice that there's something a little unique about this quilt. It looks like it's almost shining, right? Well, she did this by choosing colors that gradate from dark on the edge to light in the center. And here's a photo I took of a detail of the quilt. Maybe you'll notice as you look at this detail that the artist, whose name is Setsuko Obi, not only was careful about the color of fabric she used, she was also careful about the type of fabric she used. What does it look like she used? Can you see any details, any patterns or prints? This quilt is made out of tiny pieces of vintage Japanese kimonos, and each piece is carefully placed to relate to the other pieces beside it. Let's look at the whole piece all together. It's an incredible illusion of light shining on a quilt, made out of little tiny pieces of clothing. If you think about your own wardrobe, and even think about clothes that you've worn over the years, if you had saved them, what an interesting quilt that would make. And if anybody was studying the quilt for different patterns and styles, they would actually learn a lot about you. It says something about you, what you choose to wear. The next quilt I want to show you literally says something about the person who made it. Here we have a bold red and white quilt with very strong geometric designs. And if you look carefully, the boxes have words in them. So now is a great time to pause the video and, with somebody, start seeing what's written there. See if some of the words jump out at you as being particularly nice or meaningful or curious. And as you're looking, you might find some very pertinent clues about who made this quilt and when it was made. So take a moment right now and see what you can find written on this quilt. Did you find the name of the quilter? It is in the lower left corner, Maria Cadman Hubbard, and she let us know that she was 79 years old when she completed this quilt in 1848. I think my favorite square is one that says, "If you cannot be a golden pippin, don't turn crabapple." Do you have a favorite saying on this quilt? Can you imagine how Maria Cadman Hubbard, the maker of that quilt, must have felt when she finally finished it and got to lay down and keep herself warm, not only with the beautiful craftsmanship of the quilt, but also with those words that represented her strongest beliefs and her faith, even. I imagine her family felt the same way in years after when they got to use that quilt for warmth. Well, the next and the last quilt I want to show you is a different kind of catalog of information. It's not so much about faith as it is about showing what that quilt knows about what I know. You'll see. Here's another photograph taken in the museum gallery. Shows a person studying this very brightly colored patchwork quilt that's covered in interesting details. I'm zooming in so you can maybe get a clue as to what this quilt is depicting. Now is a great time to pause the video if you like and see if you can identify any of these figures or shapes or forms. What do you think this quilt is all about? Let's take a look at the whole quilt. And now you have the ultimate clue. The title of this quilt is Greek Myths Quilt. And it was created by Dr. Raymond Bellamy, who was the head of the sociology department at Florida State University. He studied and taught, among other things, botany and psychology and Greek mythology. And he has created this fantastic quilt with little captions and cartoons demonstrating different parts of Greek mythology for any of us to study and enjoy. But this wasn't the only quilt that Dr. Bellamy made to catalog his knowledge. He also made other quilts, for example, American birds, flowers. It seems that this was a favorite way he had of not only showing the knowledge that he had, but maybe giving an opportunity for others to learn through his very colorful and talented quilt making. When you think about it, any base of knowledge that you've acquired over the years could make an interesting quilt. You know, whether it's a skill or trade that you have and the tools of that trade, that would make a beautiful quilt. Or places that you've been. It's interesting to think about what would you put on a quilt if you could make a whole catalog of information that you've learned over the years. Let's take a little review of the three kinds of quilts we looked at from this exhibition and the three different ways those artists gave us a little bit of a sense of who they are and the lives that they've led. We saw Setsuko Obi's use of used clothing in tiny pieces to create an illusion of light. We saw Maria Cadman Hubbard's beautiful Pleiades quilt, which literally tells us what her beliefs are. And we saw Dr. Bellamy's Greek Myths quilt, which shows a book's worth of Greek mythology on one quilt. What I love about this exhibition that those three quilts came from is that those are only three out of so many different ways artists have found to express themselves and tell their stories and share their lives and their communities sometimes through quilt making. I encourage you to go to our website, and if you're interested in learning more about what else is in the exhibition, there have been different programs that have been recorded and are available to watch. And I just encourage you to look and see what else is up there on those walls. If you're in the New York City area, come visit anytime. This has been another video visit. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you next time.